Speaker.
Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Northern Mariana Islands,
Mr. Speaker.
Northern Mariana Islands,
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Northern Mariana Islands.
Mr. Northern Mariana Islands,
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Northern Mariana Islands. Northern Mariana Islands. Northern Islands. Mr. Speaker. Northern
Mariana Islands,
Mr. Speaker, Northern Mariana Islands. Northern Mariana Islands. Mr. Speaker, Northern Mariana Islands. Northern Mariana Islands. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Fort Ontario.
Mr. Northern Mariana Islands,
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Fort Ontario. Fort Ontario.
Northern Mariana Islands,
Mr. Speaker, Fort Ontario, Fort Ontario, Fort Ontario, Fort Ontario, Fort Ontario.
Mr. Speaker.
Fort Ontario, Ontario. Fort Ontario, Ontario. Fort Ontario, Fort Ontario, Fort Ontario. Fort Ontario, Fort Ontario. Fort Ontario. Mr. Speaker.
Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Northern Mariana Islands,
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Speaker,
Mr.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.